The first time I noticed something different, something I couldn't quite put into words, it was during one of those long summer evenings. The kind where the sun lingers on the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and amber, while time seems to stretch infinitely. I was staying at my grandmother Marianne's countryside home for the season, a place that always felt suspended in its own world, untouched by the chaos of the city. Marianne was unlike any grandmother I had ever imagined. She wasn't the frail, gray-haired matron one might picture. At 59, she carried herself with a vitality and elegance that made her seem timeless. Her hair, a silvery blonde, fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her sharp blue eyes sparkled with a mischievous intelligence. She had always been a commanding presence, the kind of woman who could silence a room with a single look, yet her laughter was infectious, filling every corner of her sprawling estate with warmth. I was 19 that summer, freshly out of my first year of college, and unsure of my place in the world. The countryside seemed like a good place to escape the noise in my head, the pressure of expectations and unspoken demands. Marianne welcomed me with open arms, her home a sanctuary where I could simply exist without question or judgment. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to notice things about her, little things that had always been there but had gone unnoticed until now. It was in the way she moved through the house, her steps light but deliberate, her presence filling every space she entered. It was in the way her laughter lingered in the air long after she had left the room, a melody that seemed to replay in my mind at the most unexpected moments. And it was in the way her gaze would sometimes linger on me, her expression unreadable, as though she were searching for something she couldn't quite find. One evening, after a day spent tending to her garden, Marianne suggested we have dinner on the terrace. The air was warm, the scent of blooming jasmine carried on the soft breeze. She had prepared a simple meal, a testament to her understated elegance, and we ate in comfortable silence, the sound of cicadas providing a soothing backdrop. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, she poured us both glasses of wine, a rare indulgence she reserved for special occasions. We sat there, the soft glow of the lanterns casting flickering shadows across her face. She looked at me then, her gaze steady and unflinching, and I felt something shift in the air between us. It wasn't overt or obvious, but it was there, a quiet tension that made my pulse quicken. I tried to dismiss it, to convince myself it was nothing more than my imagination, but the way her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile told me otherwise. As the weeks went on, that tension only grew. It was in the way her hand would brush against mine when she passed me a dish at dinner, or the way her laughter seemed to carry a note of something deeper when we shared a joke. It was in the stolen glances, the moments when her eyes lingered on me just a second too long, and the way her touch seemed to burn through my skin, leaving a trail of fire in its wake. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered down to the library. It was one of my favorite rooms in the house, its towering shelves filled with books that seemed to hold the weight of countless lifetimes. The faint scent of aged paper and leather always brought me a sense of calm, and I often found myself retreating there when my thoughts became too loud. I didn't expect to find her there, sitting by the fireplace with a book resting on her lap, her expression thoughtful as she stared into the flickering flames. She looked up when I entered, her gaze softening as she saw me. She gestured for me to join her, and I hesitated for only a moment before crossing the room and sinking into the chair opposite her. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence between us comfortable but heavy with unspoken words. Finally, she set her book aside and leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees as she studied me. Her eyes seemed to pierce through me, seeing parts of me I hadn't even known were there. She reached out then, her hand brushing against mine, and the contact sent a jolt through me. I froze, unsure of what to do, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers lingered, her touch both firm and gentle, grounding me in a way I couldn't explain. In that moment, something unspoken passed between us, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond we shared. It wasn't just familial, nor was it something I could easily define. It was deeper, more complex, a connection that defied explanation. And though the rational part of my mind screamed at me to pull away, to put distance between us, I couldn't bring myself to move. Her touch, her presence, was magnetic, drawing me in despite every instinct telling me to resist. When she finally pulled back, the absence of her touch was palpable, a physical ache that left me reeling. She stood then, her movements slow and deliberate, and looked down at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but instead, she simply turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the flickering fire and the whirlwind of emotions she had stirred within me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of her touch, the weight of her gaze, the way her presence seemed to linger in the air around me. Something had changed between us, something that couldn't be undone. And though I didn't know what it meant or where it would lead, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after that unsettling night in the library was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The house, with its vast halls and sprawling rooms, seemed to hold its breath, as if it, too, was aware of the invisible line that had been crossed. I woke early, unable to shake the lingering weight of the previous evening, and wandered downstairs in search of some distraction. Marianne was already in the kitchen, her movements fluid and purposeful as she prepared breakfast. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread filled the air, a comforting reminder of normalcy in a world that suddenly felt anything but. She glanced up as I entered, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything left unsaid. I sat at the table, my eyes following her as she moved around the kitchen. She seemed composed, as always, but there was something different in the way she carried herself, a tension that wasn't there before. Her hands lingered on the edge of the counter for just a second too long, and when she finally turned to face me, her gaze was steady but guarded. The meal passed in near silence, the clinking of silverware and the rustle of the morning paper the only sounds to break the stillness. I found myself watching her more closely than I ever had before, noting the way her lips curved faintly when she sipped her coffee, the way her fingers brushed against the edge of the table as she spoke. There was a quiet elegance to her, a kind of effortless grace that seemed to draw me in despite my best efforts to resist. As the days went on, that tension only grew. Our interactions were charged with an unspoken energy that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. It was in the way her hand would linger on my shoulder for just a moment too long, or the way her laughter carried an edge of something deeper when we shared a joke. Each moment felt like a test, a delicate balance between what was and what could never be. One afternoon, Marianne suggested we take a walk through the garden. It was something we'd done countless times before, but this time felt different. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and blooming flower beds. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of lavender and roses, and the distant hum of cicadas provided a soothing backdrop to our steps. We walked side by side, our conversation light and aimless, but the space between us felt smaller than ever. I could feel the warmth of her presence, the subtle brush of her arm against mine as we moved. When we reached the small pond at the far end of the garden, she paused, her gaze fixed on the still water as if searching for something just beneath its surface. I stood beside her, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing moment. She turned to me then, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. Her expression was unreadable, her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, she reached out, her fingers grazing my arm in a touch so light it sent a shiver through me. The moment stretched, timeless and infinite, as the world around us seemed to fade away. Her hand lingered, her touch both grounding and electrifying, and I felt the now familiar pull of her presence, the unspoken connection that bound us together. My heart pounded in my chest, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and longing, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. When she finally let go, the absence of her touch was palpable, leaving behind a hollow ache that I couldn't ignore. She turned and began to walk back toward the house, her steps slow and deliberate, and I followed, my mind racing with the weight of what had just passed between us. That evening, the house felt different. The rooms seemed larger, emptier, as if the walls themselves were aware of the shift in our dynamic. I retreated to my bedroom, seeking solace in the familiar, but the memory of her touch lingered, a constant reminder of the boundary we had skirted. I lay awake for hours, the events of the day replaying in my mind, each moment etched into my memory with startling clarity. The following morning, Marianne was waiting for me in the dining room, her demeanor calm but her eyes betraying a flicker of something deeper. She suggested we spend the day cleaning out the attic, a task she'd been meaning to tackle for years but had never found the time for. I agreed, eager for anything that might distract me from the turmoil inside me. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten memories, its dusty shelves and overflowing boxes filled with remnants of a life lived long before I had ever entered it. We worked side by side, sorting through old photographs and yellowed letters, our conversation light and easy. But every so often, our hands would brush as we reached for the same item, or our eyes would meet across the dimly lit room, and the tension between us would flare once more. By the time the sun began to set, the attic was still cluttered, but we had made some progress. Marianne suggested we take a break, and we sat on the floor amidst the chaos, sipping glasses of water and sharing stories about the items we'd unearthed. She seemed more relaxed, her laughter coming more easily, and for a moment, it felt as though things might return to normal. But as the light faded and the shadows grew longer, that familiar tension returned, wrapping around us like a shroud. Marianne's gaze lingered on mine, her expression soft but searching, and I felt the air between us shift once more. Whatever unspoken bond had formed between us was growing stronger, more undeniable, and I knew that no matter how much I tried to resist, there was no escaping the pull of her presence. The following days passed in a blur of routine and carefully orchestrated avoidance. Marianne and I seemed to orbit around each other, our interactions reduced to polite exchanges and fleeting glances. Yet, beneath the surface, the tension remained, an unspoken current that neither of us could escape. One evening, the weight of it all became too much to bear. I found myself in the garden again, the air cool and heavy with the scent of earth and blooming flowers. The stars above were impossibly bright, their light casting a soft glow over the estate. I wandered aimlessly, my thoughts a tangled web of confusion and longing, until I found myself at the small bench beneath the old oak tree where Marianne often sat to read. I didn't expect to find her there, but as I approached, I saw her silhouette illuminated by the faint light of the lantern she had brought with her. She was sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her expression distant as she gazed out over the garden. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure whether to approach or retreat. But something in the way her shoulders sagged, the quiet vulnerability in her posture, drew me in. When she noticed me, her eyes softened, and she gestured for me to join her. I sank onto the bench beside her, the space between us both vast and unbearably close. For a long time, we sat in silence, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant chirping of crickets. The quiet was comforting but heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Marianne turned to me then, her gaze steady and unflinching. There was something in her eyes that I couldn't quite place, a mixture of sadness and resolve that made my chest ache. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on mine, and the touch sent a shiver through me. Her fingers were warm, her grip firm yet gentle, and I felt the weight of her presence in every inch of my being. As her hand lingered, the air between us seemed to shift, charged with a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. My mind raced, a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that I couldn't untangle. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but no words came. Instead, I looked at her, searching her expression for some hint of what she was thinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of everything she had been holding back. She didn't say much, but her words were enough to shatter the fragile barrier we had built between us. They hung in the air, undeniable and irrevocable, leaving no room for pretenses or denials. In that moment, something shifted between us, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. She leaned closer, her presence overwhelming, and I felt the pull of her gaze, the magnetic force that had drawn us together time and time again. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. When she pulled back, her expression was unreadable, her eyes searching mine for some kind of reaction. I didn't know what to say, what to do. The enormity of what had just happened left me breathless, my thoughts a chaotic mess of confusion and longing. But even as my mind screamed at me to pull away, to run, I couldn't move. Her presence was magnetic, grounding me in a way I couldn't explain. We sat there for what felt like hours, the silence between us filled with a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Eventually, Marianne stood, her movements slow and deliberate, and without a word, she turned and walked back toward the house, leaving me alone beneath the stars. That night, I couldn't sleep. The memory of her touch, the look in her eyes, replayed in my mind on an endless loop. I felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted, leaving me unmoored and unsure of what came next. The boundaries that had once seemed so clear were now blurred, and I didn't know how to navigate the space we now found ourselves in. The following morning, Marianne was distant, her usual warmth replaced by a quiet detachment that I couldn't quite decipher. She went about her day as though nothing had happened, her movements measured and deliberate, but I could see the cracks in her composure. Her gaze lingered on me for just a second too long, and when our hands brushed as she passed me a cup of coffee, the spark of electricity was undeniable. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth, its walls closing in on the weight of our shared secret. Every interaction, every glance, felt like a test, a reminder of the line we had crossed and the path we now found ourselves on. And though I didn't know where it would lead, I knew one thing for certain: there was no going back. The days that followed were marked by a charged silence that seemed to echo through every room of the house. Marianne and I continued to navigate around each other, our interactions measured and careful, yet the undercurrent of tension remained ever present. The estate, once a sanctuary of peace and simplicity, now felt like a maze filled with unspoken truths and forbidden emotions. One afternoon, the clouds hung low in the sky, casting the garden in muted shades of gray. The rain had started as a gentle drizzle but soon transformed into a steady downpour, the sound of water pattering against the windows filling the house. I had retreated to the sitting room, a book in hand, though my mind was far from the words on the page. Marianne entered without announcement, her presence immediately commanding the space. She was dressed in a simple cardigan and jeans, her hair slightly damp from the rain, framing her face in soft waves. She didn't speak as she crossed the room to stand by the window, her gaze fixed on the rain-soaked garden. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. I watched her from my seat, my pulse quickening as I took in the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers brushed against the windowpane as though lost in thought. Her presence was magnetic, pulling me in despite the chaos of emotions swirling inside me. When she finally turned to face me, her expression was unreadable, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. She gestured toward the chair opposite mine, silently asking for permission to join me. I nodded, unable to find my voice, and she settled into the seat, her movements slow and deliberate. For a long moment, we simply sat there, the sound of the rain filling the space between us. It was a fragile sort of calm, the kind that felt as though it could shatter with the slightest provocation. Marianne leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap, and her gaze dropped to the floor before rising to meet mine. There was a vulnerability in her expression that I hadn't seen before, a crack in the composed exterior she always presented to the world. She didn't speak, but her eyes conveyed everything: the conflict, the fear, the undeniable connection that had grown between us. Without thinking, I reached out, my hand covering hers in a gesture that felt both natural and fraught with meaning. Her fingers tensed beneath mine for a brief moment before relaxing, and I felt a quiet hum of energy pass between us. It was a small act, but it carried the weight of everything we couldn't say aloud. Her gaze softened, and the corners of her lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound of it drumming against the windows creating a rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. Marianne's other hand moved, her fingers brushing against mine, and the contact sent a shiver through me. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but words felt inadequate for the complexity of the moment. Instead, we sat there, our hands intertwined, the unspoken bond between us growing stronger with each passing second. Eventually, she pulled away, her movements slow and deliberate as though reluctant to sever the connection. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her cardigan, and looked down at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. There was a sadness in her eyes, but also a quiet determination that made my chest tighten. She turned and left the room without a word, leaving me alone with the sound of the rain and the memory of her touch. The air felt heavier in her absence, the silence more oppressive. I sat there for what felt like hours, my thoughts racing as I replayed the moment in my mind, each detail etched into my memory with startling clarity. That evening, the storm continued, the rain relentless as it pounded against the roof. I found myself wandering through the halls of the house, unable to settle in one place for long. My steps eventually led me to the library, where the faint glow of a fire flickered in the hearth. Marianne was there, seated in the same armchair she often occupied, her gaze fixed on the flames. She looked up as I entered, her expression softening ever so slightly. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to stay or retreat, but the look in her eyes drew me in. I crossed the room and sank into the chair opposite hers, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the chill that lingered in the air. We didn't speak, but the silence between us was no longer heavy. It was different now, filled with an unspoken understanding that felt both comforting and unsettling. The flames danced in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across her face, and I found myself captivated by the way the light played across her features. As the evening wore on, the storm outside began to wane, the rain tapering off to a gentle patter. Marianne eventually rose from her seat, her movements graceful and deliberate. She paused by the fire, her gaze lingering on the flames for a moment before turning to me. Her eyes held a quiet resolve, and though she didn't speak, I understood the message she was trying to convey. She left the library without another glance, leaving me alone with the dying fire and the echoes of everything that had passed between us. I sat there long after she had gone, the silence of the house pressing down on me as I tried to make sense of the storm that had taken root in my heart. The boundaries that once seemed so clear were now irreparably blurred, and I knew that the path ahead would be anything but simple. The storm that had raged for days finally cleared, leaving the estate bathed in the pale light of dawn. The air felt fresh, renewed, but inside the house, the tension remained, thick and unyielding. Every glance, every word between Marianne and me carried the weight of all that had passed, and though we tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, it was clear that the boundary we had crossed could never be undone. Marianne had grown quieter in the days following our last encounter, her usual warmth replaced by a distant, almost reflective demeanor. She carried herself with her usual grace, but there was a heaviness in her movements, as though the burden of what we shared had begun to take its toll. I found myself watching her more closely than ever, searching for any sign of what she might be thinking, but her expression remained unreadable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marianne asked me to join her for dinner on the terrace. It was a simple request, one that she had made countless times before, but there was something in her tone that gave me pause. I agreed, my heart racing as I made my way to the table she had set beneath the sprawling canopy of wisteria. The meal was quiet, the usual chatter and laughter absent. Marianne seemed lost in thought, her gaze drifting to the horizon as though searching for answers in the fading light. I wanted to speak, to say something that might bridge the chasm that had grown between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I watched her, captivated by the way the soft glow of the lanterns illuminated her face, casting her features in delicate shadow. After dinner, she suggested we take a walk through the garden. The air was cool, the scent of blooming flowers carried on the gentle breeze. We strolled in silence, the only sounds the soft crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the distant chirping of crickets. When we reached the pond at the far end of the garden, Marianne stopped, her gaze fixed on the still water. For a long moment, she said nothing, her expression contemplative. Then, without turning to face me, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. She talked about the choices we make, the paths we take, and the consequences that follow. Her words were measured, each one carrying a weight that seemed to press down on me. She didn't mention us explicitly, but the meaning behind her words was clear. When she finally turned to look at me, her eyes were filled with a sadness that made my chest ache. She reached out, her hand brushing against mine, and the touch was both comforting and devastating. I wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that we could find a way to move forward, but the look in her eyes told me she had already made up her mind. "This can't continue," she said, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. "It isn't right." I opened my mouth to protest, to argue, but the words caught in my throat. Deep down, I knew she was right. What we had shared, as powerful and consuming as it was, couldn't exist in the world beyond the walls of the estate. It was a flame that burned too brightly, destined to consume us if we let it. Marianne's hand lingered on mine for a moment longer before she pulled away, her movements slow and deliberate. She turned and began to walk back toward the house, her steps measured and purposeful. I stood there, rooted in place, watching her retreating figure until she disappeared into the shadows. The following morning, she was gone. A note left on the kitchen counter explained that she had decided to visit an old friend in the city, a trip she hadn't taken in years. The words were carefully chosen, each one crafted to convey a sense of normalcy, but I could feel the finality in them. She hadn't said when she would return, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was her way of creating distance, of putting space between us to prevent what had already begun from spiraling further. The house felt empty in her absence, the silence oppressive. I wandered through the rooms aimlessly, each one a reminder of her presence and the moments we had shared. The garden, once a place of solace, now felt like a prison, its beauty marred by the weight of memories that refused to fade. Days turned into weeks, and life at the estate resumed its usual rhythm. The staff carried on with their duties, the routines of daily life unfolding as though nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. The connection I had felt with Marianne, the bond that had grown between us, remained, a quiet ache that I carried with me wherever I went. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, I found myself back at the pond. The water was still, the surface reflecting the vibrant hues of the sky above. I sat on the bench beneath the old oak tree, the same place where so much had begun, and allowed myself to remember. The laughter, the stolen glances, the moments of quiet understanding, they all played out in my mind like a film, vivid and unrelenting. As the first stars appeared in the sky, I felt a sense of closure settle over me. What had happened between Marianne and me was something I would carry with me forever, a part of who I was. It wasn't something I could explain or justify, but it was ours, a fragment of time that had shaped us both in ways we might never fully understand. I rose from the bench, the cool evening air brushing against my skin, and made my way back to the house. The path ahead was uncertain, the future a blank canvas waiting to be filled. But as I stepped inside, I felt a quiet resolve take root within me. Whatever came next, I would face it, carrying the memory of Marianne with me as both a reminder and a guide.